While we've increased the profit forecast for the year to about 30 billion, and it's on the back of an improvement in the revenue performance, but we've also seen an increase in costs. But when we translate that 30 billion into margin, it's a net margin of about 3.1%. That is wafer thin. And there's still a long way for us to go as an industry to generate margins that would be considered sustainable for, for this industry and any other industry. It's very important, to be able to invest in products to serve the customers, but also the significant investment that will be required in sustainable aviation fuel, which is clearly a challenge for all airlines. But it's important that the industry is, financially sustainable to ensure that it can be environmentally sustainable. The two go hand in hand, and there's still room for improvement. But it's important to point out, actually, the highest net margin that the industry has ever delivered was in 2015 and 2017 at 5%. So even at 5%, that's still a very low net margin compared to other industries. So, we shouldn't even be satisfied getting back to those levels of profitability. I think we need to go further as well. This is very important for IATA, and I think to give credit to the taxation team. I think they're doing an extremely good job to make sure that governments and tax agencies and tax experts understand the challenges that aren't necessarily unique to the airline industry, but can be issues of particular interest to the airline industry. And we have seen new proposals to change the way taxes are calculated for airlines, not based on any concerns about the airline industry, often based on what we've seen in the shipping industry, and they're translating those measures to airlines, which quite honestly I struggle to understand, because the regime of tax collection for airlines has worked well. Taxes are paid in the country of domicile of the airline. Changing that is going to introduce significant complexity, and I think has the potential to impact on the network that airlines provide. So it's going to require a lot of complex calculations for airlines, and quite honestly, I don't believe it's going to achieve some of the objectives that people have highlighted, which would be greater tax revenues to developing nations. The risk is actually you see significant disruption to the network of services that these developing nations have. So I think we need to be very careful and as an industry make sure that the tax regulators understand the unintended consequences of some of the changes that they're proposing. It's very, very frustrating. In fact, when we had the Board of Governors meeting, a number of CEOs highlighted this as being the most significant challenge that the airline industry faces. This proliferation of passenger rights, in many cases conflicting rules and regulations, and the concerns that, the impact that this would have on not just how we operate, but, could potentially conflict with our compliance with safety regulations as well. So it's a very complex area. The bottom line here is that, ultimately consumers are going to pay the additional costs that are being faced by the industry, because going back to what we talked about margins, with margins of 3%, there's no way the industry can absorb the additional or the potential additional costs that we'll face. So again, we need regulators to understand both the what they're trying to achieve, but also the unintended consequences of what they're trying to do. And really, it would be much better if we had, a coordinated approach to this, rather than the, what we're seeing at the moment, where individual countries are learning from experience in others and trying to make it better, in our case worse. And, there's clear evidence that the European regulations, EU 261, are not doing what was intended, so it's leveled, it's created additional costs for the industry, but it hasn't improved. Cancellations hasn't improved on-time performance, and airlines don't need a financial incentive to be better at their on-time performance. That's what we try and do every day. Nobody wants to operate flights that are late, and nobody wants to see a flight cancelled. And when you look at what happened in the UK with the collapse of the NAT system, the idea that somehow airlines should pay for that, given that it had nothing to do with the airlines, I think it's just so unfair, particularly when you consider that the people who caused the problem haven't had to pay a single penny and continue to laud themselves on how well they did recovering without focusing on the mess they created in the first place. So yeah, very, very frustrating. We're there to support the industry. We're there to ensure that the industry has services that can be provided by us to ensure that we're not, as an industry, being exploited by third parties. And in the past, there was often the case that data for the industry was being provided at huge cost when we were able to produce data at a significantly lower cost to the industry. So ensuring that there's competition in the market there is very important, that the industry is not held captive by a small group of suppliers, or indeed in some cases monopoly suppliers. And also it's to recognise the fact that the airlines trust us with their data. They know we're going to use the data for the reasons we've collected. It's not to seek to exploit it for other reasons. So I think we've got a very significant role to play. I think the contribution that we make through the analysis of the data that's available to us for the benefit of the industry and sharing that with our members is very, very important, and becomes even more important with developments in machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think data is really critical to the future of the industry, and having a reliable, secure source of data that the industry can rely on, I think, is very, very important. Safety benefits from the analysis of data, and we have a lot of data available to us. Being able to analyse that using artificial intelligence, machine learning, enables us to enrich the value of the data for the benefit of safety improvement. So I think this is really exciting. I think we do a great job with the data analysis we have, but being able to do it faster, do it in a more detailed fashion, look at new ways of investigating the data, all with the objective of learning from this data so that we can continue to improve the safety performance. It's one of the most exciting things that I've seen in my career in this industry. I think our role is to ensure that governments understand the opportunity that exists here, and I think we're doing a good job at that, but also to better understand the role that they have to play, in the same way as they played a role in the transition to solar and wind for the benefit of the environment. They have a significant role to play in the transition from traditional jet kerosene to sustainable aviation fuel. And we can't do it on our own. We just don't have the financial ability to do this on our own. We have to work with others, and governments need to provide the policy framework, the right incentives. They need to be very clear that the measures they're taking have the intended consequences, and recognise that when they have unintended consequences that they need to change that. Politicians are slow to acknowledge mistakes and often persist in doing things that are wrong because they prefer to do that than to put their hand up and say they need to go back. So we've got to work with governments and regulators and everybody to ensure that greater sustainability, a greater supply of sustainable aviation fuel is made available, and that's going to have to be working together. As I said, we can't do it on our own. We rely on lots of other partners to deliver on this, but governments have a very important role to play to ensure that the framework is there to incentivise greater production. We are seeing an increase in the level of sustainable aviation fuel being produced, but it's still at very low quantities compared to what we need. So I think we've estimated it'll be just over 0.5% of the fuel that we'll use this year. Now, it's going in the right direction, but that's slow and incremental growth, and we need to see a step change. I think the positive is we are seeing significant investment in certain parts of the world, particularly the US, in facilities to produce more sustainable fuel. And in fact, I'm hearing more and more exciting stories coming out of the US, where the government at a federal level has provided incentives and tax breaks, and at state level there's some incentives as well. So the story in the US is actually quite encouraging. We need to ensure that that story is heard by other governments around the world, and that the lessons from what the US is doing can be learnt. But there's a clear difference between what the US is doing, where they're incentivizing, if you like, using the carrot approach, to what the EU is doing, which is very much the stick. You know, they're trying to beat people up, and it's not working. In fact, it's ridiculous what we're seeing there. Zero environmental benefit. If I look at France, where they have a blending mandate, which requires fuel companies to produce SAF to blend. The fuel companies aren't doing it, but they don't care, because the financial penalties that they're facing, they're just passing on to airlines because they're a monopoly supplier. We don't have an option. So it's done zero, absolutely nothing to improve the production of sustainable fuel, and has just merely added to the cost of operating, which ultimately gets borne by the consumer. So no environmental impact and negative economic impact.